chaos and clashing at nightfall on the streets of Brooklyn.
Well, that sure escalated.
Muslims and Jews and others coming together, calling for a ceasefire in the Mideast.
The crowd growing as it marches through Midtown, snarling traffic, daring police to make arrests.
We cannot let a genocide happen on our hands.
I don't see how bombing Gaza is preventing more people from joining Hamas.
We have to do what we have to do for justice and for peace.
This is how many people got arrested in the protest near my apartment. But that's nothing. Protests have been happening for the last 2 weeks, and some of them, hundreds of people have been arrested. These things, they always start out small with good intentions. And then they seem to end in handcuffs for some reason.
Gaza resiste, Palestina existe.
Now, the video here is from several small protests that took place near where I live in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. They started out all over the place, and then they all kind of converged on one location, and that's when things took a turn for the worst. And people ended up getting arrested for clashing with the police. Now, these were pro-Palestinian protests, and many of those involved are critical of Israel's actions in the Middle East, and they're hoping for a ceasefire that would prevent the loss of innocent life in Gaza, where Hamas also resides. And as much as many people in New York wish to stamp out Hamas for good, many people are protesting because it doesn't look like that can be done without harm coming to people who didn't do anything. But one thing's for sure, the longer this conflict goes on, the more protests there will be in America, Europe, all across the world. And earlier this week, protesters were already clashing with police here in Midtown, and you won't believe what they were planning.
Streets of Manhattan, demonstrators are calling on Congress to stop military aid to Israel.
A few days ago, 150 pro-Palestinian protesters were arrested right here in Midtown in a protest that took over all of these streets and blocked traffic. The goal of the protesters was to march from here at the library across to 3rd Avenue to the office of a U.S. senator. The protesters feel the U.S. government is playing a large role in this situation, and they wanted to voice their opinions in a way that would get the attention of their elected representative. The march started here, headed east, and there were so many people that cars could not move down the streets. And that's why you see a lot of police barricades just all over the place. These are collateral from demonstrations that had to be reined in. How you doing? Nice to meet you.
Can I get a selfie?
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks for watching. I need all the help I can get. Take it easy. Anyways, these demonstrations, they're so big and so massive and so numerous that they're starting to shut down New York City, and they're preventing it from operating the way that it needs to operate for people here to live their lives. But are they working?
Senators are responsible for funding, and so we have to defund Israel and the IDF because we cannot let a genocide happen on our hands.
This is the senator whose office they were trying to reach. She's one of New York's 2 senators. And apparently the protesters had been congregating here in Midtown all afternoon before making their way over to her office. And just like with the little protest that I witnessed, during the day, things were relatively peaceful. But then once evening came around, things got violent.
The crowd growing as it marches through Midtown, snarling traffic, sitting down in the middle of 3rd Avenue, daring police to make arrests.
So apparently this protest was so large that the NYPD ran out of resources to control the situation and had to resort to using city buses to get people off site. City buses just like this one. They took them out of service. The streets were full of police, and these scenes are a testament to the fact that New York City just isn't really prepared for massive protests like this to be a daily or weekly occurrence. And if protests turn violent, is that really the best way to call for peace?
We're out here, it's pouring rain, we're wet, but they have blood on their hands.
This is not one group, more of a coalition with what they say is a pretty simple message, that the answer to the violence so far cannot be more violence.
Now, an anti-violence message, that's definitely the right message, at least in my book, but if your methods are violent, it might get a little convoluted. But the situation in the Middle East has resulted in mass casualties on all sides. And many New Yorkers have family not just in Israel, but also in Gaza. This is a bad situation that could spiral out of control, not just in the Middle East, but also here in New York.
And unfortunately, our political leaders seem to keep failing to learn that lesson again and again, that war is not the answer.
Well, there have definitely been crazier protests here in New York over the last 3 to 5 years. And protesting in highly populated public places, trying to reach elected officials, that's not controversial. But what is controversial is what the protesters tried to do next.
A tense protest overnight here in New York in front of the Brooklyn home of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Dozens of demonstrators, you can see them there, were arrested, including 2 state lawmakers.
This protest also took place where I live, and the protesters were searching for the apartment building that the other senator from New York lives in. This isn't it, but they were looking for Chuck Schumer's apartment. He's the Senate Majority Leader. And look at that, he's been in politics since 1975, longer than I've been alive, just like most of Washington. Now, the right time to meet somebody like Chuck Schumer is when you see all these signs and you have the opportunity to do it. Don't laugh. You would have met him too if you saw him standing all by himself in the middle of the street with one of his aides next to him with a sign that says, "Meet Chuck Schumer." We didn't talk politics. Anyways, protesters showed up at his apartment demanding a ceasefire, and these crowds were massive. It was more of the same, civil disobedience. And once again, the situation was too extreme for the NYPD. They had to take more of these guys and use them to get people off site. Also, Senator Schumer is Jewish, and he was on his way to Israel.
And there were protesters outside demanding that he call for a ceasefire as he travels to Israel with lawmakers.
Now, in this protest, you also had over 100 people getting arrested, but what makes it different is that 2 elected officials in New York were also arrested. And one of the lawmakers that was arrested in front of his place was also at the protest earlier, right here in Midtown, headed to the other senator's office. And look at what he had to say.
We believe in the sanctity of all life, and so we have condemned the civilians who on October 7th from Hamas's horrific attacks, and we condemn the 4,100 Palestinians who have been since then.
When you hear someone's been arrested, you automatically think the worst, but they don't seem that unreasonable with this pro-peace message. This protest in Minneapolis was also attended by a lawmaker who was out there whipping cars along with the people that were surrounding them. And that's not what's been happening here in New York. And many New Yorkers just want to see an end to all this fighting as quickly as possible. And what's incredible is these protests that started right here in New York City 2 weeks ago, not only have they spread worldwide to other major cities, not even in the United States, they're also having a profound effect on America itself. Here we are, Times Square, and this is where the protest started that spread to the rest of the country.
Pro-Palestinian protesters making their way inside of the Cannon House office building.
You can see the crowd there has certainly thinned out, and that's because Capitol Police have been making arrests for the past few hours.
And now the protests have spread all the way to the nation's capital, inside buildings at the Capitol. And according to USA Today, this protest was organized by 2 different groups, Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. And although the message of the protest is the same as the ones we've had here in New York, the methodology was not the same. Protesters actually entered the Capitol. Look at that big circle of protesters. You can see the yellow-vested police keeping an eye on everything. And this led to 308 arrests. Charges included crowding and obstruction, but nobody was arrested and detained. Just arrested and ticketed and released. This isn't just taking over New York. It's not just taking over D.C. These anti-war protests are happening in all sorts of major cities all over the country. Look at this. Protesters were climbing on the CNN building in Atlanta, Georgia. But the really interesting thing about this is these protests and mass gatherings are forcing politicians to take sides on this issue in an upcoming election year, and that's something a lot of politicians don't want to do because it could cost votes. If you're a politician here in New York, you might not win an election if you lose too many votes. And just like like you had elected officials at the pro-Palestinian rally that ended up getting arrested. You've got other elected officials like Chuck Schumer that are heading to Israel in a vocal display of support. So you've got some Democrats that are pro-Palestine, some that are pro-Israel. Are there any pro-Palestine Republicans? We've seen some Republicans say that the war needs to end and we shouldn't get engaged in the war, but that's not all of them.
Is he okay? How many more Palestinian lives is he comfortable with? Because I'm not comfortable with any more.
That was Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, and her sentiments are exactly what's playing out here in New York, in DC, and all over the world in these protests. And what's interesting is this comes at a time when the Biden administration is asking for more funding. Ukraine, the border, and Israel, all in one package, totaling $105 billion. That is a lot of money. Since 1946, the United States has provided Israel with $317 billion, along with $3.3 billion in 2022, including weapons. And this has caused critics of Israel to arise in the most unlikely of places. Former President Donald Trump criticized Israel, said they should have been better prepared. But former President Trump's critics point out that Israel was not attacked by a bunch of amateurs. They were attacked by an organization that essentially functions as a proxy army of Iran, where they get training and weapons and money and support. And apparently this attack had been planned for years. But regardless, the attack on Israel 2 weeks ago and the outpouring of support, not just for people in Israel, but also for Palestine, that support here in America is quickly overtaking other issues in American politics. Many people are concerned with what war could mean for friends and loved ones in those parts of the world, and also for us here at home. And here in New York, police have had to increase security presence at houses of worship throughout the city. And on top of this, you've got inflation, gas prices, home prices, the border, homelessness. Americans have a lot to consider and a lot to vote on in November of 2024. But what do you think? Let me know if I missed anything. I'll see you in the next video.